Hi everybody, my name is Lauren and welcome to the Omnivorous Bookworm. So this is my final wrap up for the Asian Readathon. I have a wrap up or check-in for week 1, a check-in for week 2, and now is my final wrap up. So I'm going to go over the books that I have read since week 2 and then just kind of an overview of the readathon, how it went, how many books I read, that kind of thing. So the the first book that I've read for this section is Other Words for Home, and it's by Jasmine Warga, and it is was it middle grade or YA? I'm not sure. It's one of those I think that could be more middle grade. I think it's more middle grade, but it's written in verse, not rhymed verse, of course, but it's written in verse, and it's about a young girl, and the first part of the book takes place in Syria, and then the next, like most of the, I could say like maybe a little bit more than the second half takes place in the U.S., and she moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, which was really interesting for me because that's originally where I'm from. I live in Mexico now, but all my family is still there, so it was really cool when I was reading it, like to see the different city places, because Cincinnati is such a small city that we hardly ever get recognized. So whenever we do, it's very exciting. um, and it's about her experience trying to, fit in. Her dad is still in Syria. Her mom is actually pregnant and moves, to the U.S. And I think what the author did a really amazing job with is taking a huge political issue and boiling it down to this young girl. And even though she's having to tackle some really huge issues with her brother is in the resistance, her mom is having a baby, her dad is in, what is becoming increasingly a war zone, as well as her best friend who is also in Syria. Um, she's just a young girl. She wants to watch movies. She wants to, make friends. She wants to, she's excited about, wanting to be in a school play and all those things that are just so relatable, while at the same time also having to integrate into a new culture, a new language. And as an ESL teacher, I think the author did a great job, showing that it's not always as dramatic as it's portrayed, but it is this sort of chronic issue, and people don't just learn a language overnight. It's not like you don't speak a language or you do. It's a gradual process, and I think she really captured that really well. The characterization was really great. Not everybody in the U.S. is super welcoming. Not everybody in the U.S. is horrible. Like, it's um, this range of attitudes, as well as sort of the attitude of family members who are embarrassed because she moves in with her uncle, who is from Syria, but his wife is American. So her cousin is half Syrian, but she doesn't speak Arabic. She's not in touch with that cult side of her family at all in that culture. And her cousin is embarrassed of her. She doesn't, for a lot of the book, she doesn't want her there. And I think she did a great job sort of capturing that without making those characters seem evil, in a really honest way. The ESL teacher was nice, so I appreciated that. Like, oh, please don't let the ESL teacher be mean. There was one kind of funny thing in the book that, and I don't speak Chinese, so I'm not 100% sure of this, but one of the students in the ESL class is Chinese, and he picks his name, like his English name is Ben, which is pretty funny because from my understanding, like Ben in Chinese means like kind of stupid. So like whenever I was teaching kids and they were Chinese, if we were ever in a book and the character's name was Ben, they would just die laughing because they're like, "Ah, teacher, do you know what that means? That means stupid. His name is stupid." And like, they thought that was really funny. So I was kind of like, I don't know that he would pick that name, but maybe he would because he would think it's funny. I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, that was sort of just a side thing. So I rated that book a 4.5. I really, really, really enjoyed it. It's really well written. It's a really quick read, and I highly recommend it. It's a middle grade book, but it's for all like middle grade will enjoy it, YA, adult, it's across the board. Everybody would love it, I think, if you like the book. All right, the second book I have is The Perilous Life of Jade by Xin Cho, and I gave this book a 3.5. It is a novella or novelette. I think it's a novella. Yeah, by a Malaysian author, and it's written about a Malaysian woman who's living in England in the early 1920s, and she also has a friend with her from Malaysia, but he's of an Indian background and she's of a Chinese background, but they're both from Malaysia. And then she's also sort of integrated. Obviously, she's upper class because, like in the 1920s, if anybody's traveling around the world, they're like are wealthy. So she's traveling. She's upper class, and she's traveling in these sort of elite circles in England. Not elite, but like the sort of artsy crowd, but artsy with people who have money. So their lifestyles are sometimes a little bit unique, and that was an interesting thing to see in the book. And I really appreciated showing that aspect and showing that, a lot of people have this perception that back in time, everybody was just, you know, very heteronormative, which was not the case. Although this is historical fiction, but it's still realistic to life. Um, and it's written as like a journal form, which was kind of, I don't know, I didn't enjoy that part of it as much. The person who's writing the journal, the main character, is supposed to be a writer, but I don't know, it's always a pet peeve of mine when journals are written with like exact dialogue and exact. I don't understand why people do that unless like you can show how you were getting that dialogue. I don't know. It's just one of those things. Unless it's written as a journal or has journal pieces incorporated, I think that works better. That was just a small thing. The main reason I gave it a 3.5 was I felt like even though it's a novella, it's short, like shorter than a novel. There were places where it was like kind of dragging, but then the characterization of her friend from India, who is an important character, um, he wasn't very well developed. Like he wasn't developed at all, I should say. So even though it was a novella, and I would give it more grace for that, there was plenty of places he could have been developed in some way. And then also the ending and how the ending was, it just felt really rushed to me. So we have the sort of like the pacing is kind of slow, and then in the ending it gets really rushed, which happens in a lot of books. Like that's a common thing to find. The next book I have is The Turtle of Oman by Naomi Shihab, and I gave that 4 stars. And it's also a middle grade book. It takes place in Oman. It's about a young boy whose parents are wealthy and well, they're like upper middle class. They're professors in Oman, and they're moving to Michigan to get their doctorates. I think it's in history. I don't remember what his parents studied. And he does not want to go. They're going to be there for 3 years. He's happy with his life in Oman. He loves his grandpa. And, 3 years for an 11-year-old, like, that's an eternity. So, he's really not happy about it. And it's just about his sort of journey, like getting ready to leave to go to the US. But the whole book takes place in Oman. I really enjoyed it. The relationship between him and his grandpa was really, really well done. I think the way the author talked about the country of Oman and all the things that he loved about it, I feel like even though it's so, like I've never lived in a desert climate or anything like that, you can just really relate to a lot of like, oh, this thing is home. Like to somebody else, this is just a normal thing. This is just like a common driveway, or this is my home. And especially for a kid, if that's the only home he's ever known, and to see his grandpa, it was just so sweet. I really, really enjoyed it. It's not like there's not a lot of plot happening. I mean, things happen, but it's not like a very fast-paced plot. But it's really well written. It's really, I really like how she gets into the head of a child. Like a lot of authors, don't always think the way that kids think, or at least how I thought, and the way she does it is really insightful. I really liked that part of it. Um, I think, and also it's just like, oh, I felt so bad for him because in some ways, you know, moving for 3 years is almost worse than like moving permanently, because it's like he's gonna stay there long enough to like get attached, and then he's gonna have to come back to Oman. So it really felt for him in the story, even though it's completely fictional. All right, and then the last one I have is When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain by Niveau, and I gave that one a 4.5. This was also a novella. It's a fantasy novella, and it's the number 2 in the Singing Hill cycle, but they're both standalone. So you don't have to read number 1 before you read number 2. You could read them in the opposite order. It wouldn't matter. I think there's only 2 right now. I enjoyed this one much more. I mean, I liked the number 1. I think I gave it 4 stars, and I gave this one 4.5. But I liked the second one much better. I'm not sure if it's because I was sort of used to the world and I was used to the style, so I didn't have to like take that time to get into it. I feel like when I read the first one, I like had to reread the beginning because I was confused about what was happening or what was going on. But I really enjoyed it. It's a similar sort of vibe where Chi is our non-binary cleric who is traveling by mammoth with their companion who's helping them to travel, because they are like going through the kingdom of An, which is supposed to be, it's like a fantasy version of imperial China, and they come across these tigers who turn into women, and they're telling them the story. Like they're both going back and forth. The tigers are telling their version, and then Chi is telling their version of the story of a woman who was like a scholar who was in love with a tiger, and then their love relationship, and the tiger like was the same as these tigers, that she could turn into a woman. So it was a lesbian relationship that they're like telling back and forth, which was pretty cool. And it was like the tigers had their version, and then Chi had their version, which I believe Chi had gotten from the scholar, like the female scholar. So it was like the female scholar's version plus the tiger's version, and like the tigers have their own sort of like culture of like, well, she said this, so it means she loved her. And it's like something really bizarre. I was like, oh, okay. So I really enjoyed how the author has that. It's very beautifully written. There's a lot of action at the end of the book that was very interesting. I really like the tigers. Like, I don't know, it was really, it's a hard one to describe because it's really weird in a lot of ways, but then it's also pretty like it doesn't feel weird when you're reading it. It's really down to earth and really just, it's kind of lulls you in with the characters, and I really love it. I really loved it. So those were the books that I have read since my week 2 check-in. So for the Asian Readathon, I have read a total of 8 books, and then an additional DNF that I did not finish. I only read 91 pages. I talk about that book in my week 1 check-in. Yeah, so as far as like the prompts for the readathon, so we have to read a nonfiction book, a book in our favorite genre. We have to have an Asian American author, or an Asian, was Asian American or Asian? This is Asian. Asian author. Yeah, it wouldn't be Asian American, would it? An Asian author, an Asian main character, and a non-US centric story. So I've gotten everything. So for my nonfiction pick, or my nonfiction one, which I talked about in week 1 and week 2, was The Reason I Jump by Naoki Higashida. I read the Spanish translation, which was La Razón por la que Salto, and it's a 13-year-old nonverbal autistic boy who's answering questions about being autistic. I enjoyed the book. I had a problem with some of the questions. I talked about that earlier. So as far as my favorite genre, I'm not sure. So I looked up on Goodreads. So I thought, well, I think my favorite genre is mystery, but I wanted to see how, like, of all the books that I read, what actually, or no, it was on Storygraph. Sorry, I looked on Storygraph, which genres I actually read the most, and it was mystery and historical were tied, which was kind of surprising to me. But I've read both of those in the readathon. So, so the mystery I read was Auntie Lee's Delights by Ovidia Yu, and that was she's a Singaporean author, and the book takes place in Singapore, so it was non-U.S. centric. And The Impossible Girl by Lydia Kong is a historical. It has, I guess, yeah, well, they talk about her father being Chinese, so I guess the main character is Asian American in that one, and the author is Asian American as well. And then as far as the countries of the author, so this is the countries that the author has listed, because again, like I said in my TBR, I'm not gonna like assume anything. I'm not gonna like stalk people. So as far as the countries that the authors have listed, 3 of my authors are from the U.S. One was from Japan, although it was a translation. One was from Singapore. One was from Malaysia, and she's living in the UK. And then the other author is Palestinian and American. That's how she had it listed. So that's what I went by. And then as far as the countries of setting, like the actual where the book was taking place, and the character's origin, so I'm putting the character with their setting, if that makes sense. So we had a USA setting with a Chinese American character. We had a Japanese setting with a Japanese main character. 2 of the books I read in the readathon were in a fictional place, but it was based on Imperial China, so it was the Singing Hill Cycle books. One of the books was in Singapore with a Singaporean setting, or a Singaporean main character. And then the next book took place in Syria and the U.S. As far as their settings, and then the main character was Syrian. And then another book took place in England and France. The main character was Malaysian. And then the last story, the setting was Oman, and the character was from Oman. So I wasn't sure, as far as like non-U.S. centric, does that mean that the author is not from the U.S., that the story isn't from the U.S.? So I think for sure the reason I jump is not U.S. centric. From what I could tell, the character is Japanese, or the character, it's not fiction. The memoir, the person writing the memoir is not he's Japanese. He's writing in Japanese, and so it seems to be not U.S. centric. The Singing Hill Cycle, the stories themselves are not U.S. centric, although the author is Asian American. So I guess that, they have that connection to the U.S., but like as far as the fantasy setting, there's nothing related to the U.S. It's a fantasy setting, and that is based on Imperial China. Obviously, not exactly, because it's fantasy. Auntie Lee's Delights is based in Singapore, so that wasn't U.S. centric either. And then The Perilous Life of Jade Yao, I don't know if I'm saying that right, sorry. That was not U.S. centric at all, because she's from Malaysia and she's living in the U.K. So, and then The Question of Red, which I ended up DNFing, was also not U.S. centric, but it doesn't count because I didn't finish it. But and that was an Indonesian author and set in Indonesia. It was just, I talked about it in week 1, but I just couldn't finish it because it was just kind of too much and kind of all over the place, like the different sections, and it felt like there were things being withheld that didn't really need to be withheld, and because there was so much distance from the character and the reader, it just was really difficult for me to get into, and I just found myself like not wanting to read. And whenever I get like that, I just stop, because if it's for fun, then, and I don't want to read it, then it's not fun anymore. Like, I'm willing to push through to a certain extent, but if I can kind of, you get that feeling like this is not going to. Well, what I did was I read the reviews, because I wanted to see if it was going to get better. Like if people said like, oh, the first 100 pages were tough, but once you get through that, it's really good. I would have tried to push through. But all the reviews I was reading, the problems that I was having with it, a lot of the people who had similar problems ended up not liking the book. So I feel like I don't think this one's for me. It's well written though. I definitely wouldn't dissuade anybody from. Well, I wouldn't dissuade anybody from choosing any book, but it definitely could be a good choice for some people. So, and maybe for me at a different time. I might pick it up again later. So that is my wrap up for the Asian Readathon. I think it was a success. I mean, I didn't have any book except for my DNF, which doesn't get a rating. I didn't have any book under a 3.5. So, I mean, that's great. I'm really excited. And I found a lot of books and authors that I will probably want to read more from in the future. And, I think that's part of the point, is to find things that you would normally pick up and I generally, I have a lot of Asian authors that I like. Well, Asia's so huge. It's like Asia. But I have a lot of Asian authors that I like to read from anyway. So for me, it was so easy and so much fun. So I really enjoyed it, and hopefully you did too. And I will look forward to doing it next year. So thanks for watching. Bye.